Hi, Bill here. I'd like to talk about how queening a pawn can lead to a gain in material. There are two ways that queening a pawn can gain material. The first is when a pawn turns into a queen and the opponent cannot capture it. For example, in this position, white moves his king out, unblocking the pawn and attacking the rook. When the rook moves, the pawn will promote. There is no safe square for the rook to move and stop the pawn. So white would make a gain of a queen minus one pawn, which is 8 points, which is a pretty big gain. So in this case, the rook cannot stop both pawns. If the rook had been on the first rank, it could, but as it is, it cannot stop both pawns. And next move, one of the pawns will queen. Black has a check. The checks don't lead to anywhere. The king can zigzag towards the rook and the checks will run out. So here's another simple one. The rook's pawn is the best pass pawn to have against a knight. The bishop fans the knight, stopping it moving to a square where it can control the queening square. So the pawn advances. In one more move, the pawn will promote. This example, this time it's the other way around. The knight stops the bishop getting back. The pawn advances. The knight stops the bishop getting back to either the short diagonal to defend the queening square or the long diagonal. So next move, the pawn will promote. In this case, it's a bishop against a bishop. The pawn advances and the white bishop stops black from moving his bishop to there. In this case, white has two connected pass pawns. Connected pass pawns are particularly powerful against a rook, bishop or knight when they're on the sixth rank. So the trick here is not to move the pawn on the opposite colour of the bishop. You move it on the same colour of the bishop, and there's no way black can stop the pawn from queening. So in this case, the bishop prevents the rook from getting to the critical squares, also stops the check. If the check was possible, the rook could get back and control the queening square from the first rank. So the pawn advances, and black cannot stop the pawn from promoting. In this case, it's similar. Pawn advances, and again the bishop stops the rook from getting behind the pawn, and the pawn stops the rook from getting to the first rank. After black takes the bishop, queen against rook is a win, eventually. Okay, so here's a good one. So pawn advances, the bishop blocks the rook from taking the pawn, and the rook can't go back to the first rank. This time, the knight and the pawn cooperate to stop the rook, stopping the pawn. And again, knight stops the rook from getting behind the pawn, and it blocks the rook from getting to the first rank. And again, similar one. Rook cannot stop the pawn from promoting. And at this time, it's a rook against the bishop. So the rook stops the bishop getting to either of the diagonals, which would stop the pawn. And this time, the knight and the pawn cut the king off, stopping the king from getting into the square of the pawn, which is here, these four squares. This is a trick worth remembering. When a pawn moves forward to the 7th, threatening to promote, and also attacking a knight, the knight cannot move and defend this square. The king is too far away, and the knight cannot do anything. What black would really like to do is be prepared to get his knight to here, which would be a fork. But there's no way a knight can move two squares diagonally. It takes 4 moves to do so. Okay, this time a pawn advances, the knight cannot stop it. The knight is weakest against a passed rook's pawn. Okay, this time Pawn advances to the 7th, and the rook cannot stop it, and the king stops the rook from getting behind. This time, 2 pawns on the 7th rank beat the rook. And the pawn advances, and the rook stops the knight from coming back to defend the queening square. Okay, so white advances the pawn. He now has 2 connected passed pawns on the 6th. And next move, the king comes a bit closer. Now white advances on the same colour as the bishop, and the pawn will promote. White now has 2 connected passed pawns on the 6th. When the knight moves, the rook's pawn advances, and the knight cannot defend the square, which is 4 moves away for the knight. And again, pawn advances, similar position as before. King comes a bit closer. Rook's pawn advances, and the knight cannot defend the queening square. Pawn advances, and the rook cannot move to defend the queening square. All white has to do is move the bishop out of the way to unblock the pawn, and the king cannot get in the square, and the pawn will queen. Knight moves out of the way. Check. That's better than going to here, which might give the chance for the bishop to defend the queening square. Black has to get out of check. Next move, white queens the pawn, and the queen will win against the bishop. This time, white's got 2 pawns, so he attacks the bishop, and next move will promote, winning the pawn for the bishop. So winning the bishop for the pawn. And knight against pawn will be an easy win. So again, we've got 2 connected passed pawns on 6 beating the bishop. Pawn advances, the king cannot get in the square. In fact, this bishop wasn't even needed. Now, there's a bit of finesse in this position. If white does the obvious move of pushing the pawn, either the rook goes behind or the king comes up and the pawn will be caught. So white does a finesse. He gives a rook check. The idea of this, white is now controlling the queening square. So after black's reply, white's got a sneaky move. He doesn't play the obvious rook takes rook, pushes a pawn, defending his own rook and attacking this rook, which is in a pin. And after rook takes rook, the pawn takes and promotes. Okay, so this time, good one to know. Rook moves down, defended by the pawn on the 7th, attacking the queening square. So soon the pawn will promote. So rook takes rook, and the pawn promotes. Now the queen is blocking the pawn, so what do we want to do? We want to move it out of the way of check, and then promote. Now we've got to be a bit careful. If we push the pawn, the king will take the knight's pawn, and white will be in the so-called bishop and the rook pawn of wrong colour ending, where the defending king is next to the centre and the bishop doesn't control the queening square. So the key is for the bishop to check. Now white gains control of the queening square, and white can now promote. And that's all the positions. So they're just some simple positions which involved promotion to gain a lead in material. So thank you for watching.